All right, thank you all for coming to the first edition of the speaker series for the CGA for this year. I'm Nate, one of the CGA fellows, along with Becca, and we're very glad to have Michael Allen from Towson University to give a talk on climate change and public health. So I'll let him introduce himself a bit more.
Great, thanks Nate. Thanks for all coming out. I think the pizza was probably a drop. So I hope there's some left, although this gentleman has 6 pieces on it. So thank you for the invitation, Nate, Becca, Shannon, for inviting me. I spent 8 years in Southeast Virginia, so Williamsburg was always kind of like a second home away from home, particularly in the autumn season. So excited to be back here and revisit. Today I'll be talking about some of my research, also critiquing some of the terminology in climate resilience that some of you may be familiar with, and happy to answer questions along the way. That's not going to work. So here we go. Some of my research there is on the left. I really stand at the intersection of climate science as a physical geographer, somebody that looks at public health outcomes, resilience to extreme heat, for example, and then the last 10 or so years, I've got heavily involved in the role of geographic education in terms of how we enhance global understanding and appreciation of the world. I, as I mentioned, spent 8 years at Old Dominion University. In 2022, I moved to Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm an assistant professor of geography there. And in 2023, I was a U.S. Fulbright scholar in Serbia, not Siberia, as my mother thought. She bought me a winter jacket. Serbia is in Eastern Europe, not nearly as cold as Siberia. That doesn't work. Forgot about that. There we go. So I just want to recognize some partners and connections that I have, because obviously nobody does research in a void. And so I want to make sure make that known that a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about today and the stuff that I've done over my career has required a lot of interdisciplinary teams, both local and global. So part of the International Society of Biometeorology, for example. And being in Virginia for so long as I was, a lot of partnerships with the Science Museum, the Forestry Department, and the like. And so those are just some of the partners that I've built and continue to maintain through my research. When we talk about the issue of climate change, climatologists often cite random stats like this, right? That 10 of the 12 or 10 of the warmest years on record have occurred in the last 20 years or something, right? And then we have some visualization there and say it's really hot. It's warming in the Arctic faster than the equatorial region, maybe, right? And then everybody's eyes glaze over. And then they throw up a picture of a polar bear and talk about how climate is impacting the polar bear. And while the polar bear is significant and cute and cuddly, I wouldn't recommend going and try to coddle a polar bear, despite what Coca-Cola says. I would argue that the coral reef is much more important to large-scale ecosystem. That the dung beetle, the canary in the coal mine, is much more relevant to the global ecosystem than that cute polar bear that most of us have never cuddled, right? And when we think about the issue of climate change, we often contextualize it as a their problem, meaning not me, and a their problem meaning not here, right? The wildfires in wildfires in Australia, right? Or the wildfires in New York City, or the smoke that we saw in New York City with the air quality of last year. So here are some pictures of those people, whoever those people are, and their impacts associated with the issue of climate change. But in reality, we're seeing climate impacts here in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and not 2100, when most of us would be dead, or some of us would be dead perhaps. Some of you are probably still alive, young whippersnappers. But right, we see impacts here, right? The right side image is at Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay, likely become the first climate refugees in the United States, and certainly the Chesapeake Bay region, right? And so as we talk about the issue of climate change today, keep that in mind, that kind of framework. So here's the framework of today's presentation. Anybody know where that picture's from? It's Yorktown, very good, yeah. Yes. So a beautiful sunrise on a bike there, looking over the river. So I'll talk about heat as a hazard, some mitigation techniques, and then kind of reframing the topic of the term resilience, which I have a lot of strong opinions about. This is a great graphic, kind of frames some of my research. The impacts of climate change on human health, and multidimensional, right? And so you can imagine people that work in policy with the UN, for example, are really interested in refugees and they fit in a piece of this, this chart, right? People looking at changing vector ecology of Lyme disease or dengue or chikungunya or whatever, right? So I fit into a small component of this, but we could think about the rising seas, the increasing temperature, the multitude of impacts related to human health that we are seeing again today here in our neighborhoods. So I got really interested in weather after the blizzard of 1993, stuck in my grandparents' house without power, with no cell phone, and then the Chicago heat wave occurred shortly thereafter. And this was a major heat wave in the quote-unquote Western world in which they actually ran out of room in the morgue. And when we think about this, right, 30 years later, what lessons have we learned from that Chicago heat wave of 1995, right? It was really hot, fine, but why else did those people, again, those people, why did those people die that perished? Anyone guess? What led to the deaths of hundreds of people in the city of Chicago in 1995? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. Like I'm teaching. Saying crickets. Yeah.
I don't know a lot, but I'm going to take a guess. I know something, like I especially know it's prevalent in Richmond. I think is it called redlining, where you have poorer neighborhoods right across from like rich neighborhoods, and typically those richer ones have green spaces and shade, and that's going to help against heat. So I'm wondering if it was more poorer.
Okay.
And
so we're talking about the social factors, right? Economics certainly played a role, right? Age played a role, right? Fixed income played a role. A lot of the individuals were elderly, living on the top of the high rises, heat rises. And so all these social dimensions are also intersecting with the issue of climate and the issue of weather and emergency management, right? So as a geographer, I think that's a great unison of these issues. Great. Fast forward. Chicago, 1995, we learned lessons, we made policy changes, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward, again, about 10 years later, this is the European heat wave of 2003 that most of you have never heard of. And yet between 40 and 70,000 people died, depending on the estimates, because of this one singular heat wave in southern France and parts of Europe, right? Why did they die? Again, demographics, social characteristics. If you've ever been to this part of Europe, you know that most of these communities do not have air conditioning, right? It's a Mediterranean climate. Open up your windows. It's kind of a beautiful, right? So the infrastructure does not exist. Much like you and I may go to the beach, mom and dad, grandma and grandpa are left at home, and they're also the most vulnerable. And so you have this double, triple, quadruple whammy associated with heat, this heat wave that most of us probably never heard of. Fast forward even more recently, right? You can look at the left image of the subcontinent of India, and those numbers at the bottom there are 55 degrees Celsius. So I'll have you do the math in terms of the conversion to the imperial system that we're all familiar with, right? We think of, oh, it's really hot today. It's 83 degrees. It's 55 C in some parts of the subcontinent of India, right? And many people maybe have air conditioning, right? So how we think about the use of energy in that way. The top right is more recent in the Pacific Northwest, again, a place that generally does not have air conditioning. The infrastructure is not built. Been to Boston, similar kind of idea. The infrastructure does not exist to have air conditioning. And yet if you have temperatures in the hundreds, our bodies are not really acclimated or prepared to do so. And the probably most famous image there on the bottom right, excuse me, is of the palace, of the guard, standing guard. I don't really know what they're guarding, but then drinking the water, right? And in that long, sometimes wool suit. I'm sweating thinking about it. We know that heat waves kill more people on average than any other natural disaster. More than flooding, more than tornadoes, more than hurricanes, often combined. It's often called the silent killer because there's no wow effect, right? When we talk about heat waves, it's like, oh, somebody's drinking some pop or margarita on the beach, or how this is communicated in the news, right? Because stay inside, it's going to be hot. And yet you see images like you see in the bottom left, or people sitting at the beach, or what have you, right? And this is not just an urban challenge. A lot of the research, because of population-based statistics and public health, for example, are catered towards looking at the larger population sets. But we have plenty of new research, emerging research on the aspect and the impact of heat on rural communities in terms of these challenges. I'm not going to belabor the point on this too long because this is a public health lecture necessarily, nor am I the person to talk about the direct physiological response of heat on human health, but I worked on some issues looking at prisoners, right, and how the equitable aspect of prisoners. And in Virginia a couple years ago, I remember reading a headline in Hampton Roads saying that some of the prisoners I forget exactly where they were in the Commonwealth, but they were living in the pools of their own sweat. Now we can say, well, they committed a crime. Now smoking a joint maybe isn't conducive to laying in your own sweat, but that's a value statement, right? So I'm not going to belabor that point. I like these little cartoons. I was talking to Shannon earlier about some of the climate data that's been turned into artistic illustrations on the right-hand side with the National Climate Assessment of looking at global temperature over time. And of course, the great sitcom, The Simpsons, illustrating that, yeah, this summer was really hot and uncomfortable, but in reality, it's the coolest summer of the rest of our lives. So get used to it, right? It's also become much more warm on average over time. We know the urban environment, because of the way in which we construct our urban environment, is warmer than the quote unquote non-urban environment, right? The way that energy is absorbed and reflected and retained over time. Energy balance equation, fantastic, great. And you can see this in flicker imagery. This is my old house in Hampton Roads. And you can see my neighbors. I'm standing there on the porch. You can see my neighbor's house there shaded by those big pine trees. And they cut those big pine trees down, and what happened to their energy bill? It went up because they are now exposed to the sun, right? What happened to my energy bill? It actually went down because I put solar panels up, right? So there's winners and losers in this discourse, right? In terms of thermal radiation exposure. And this issue of heat is not going away, as I alluded to with the issue of climate change, because yes, it's happening, and yes, it's human caused. And most of us live in the cities, right? Where we become more of an urban species, and consequently the way in which we design our cities is increasingly important. Virginia is similar to Maryland in terms of the total, a little bit less, total population that lives in urban cities. So someone was alluding to earlier the Richmond study with redlining. Some of you may be familiar with that. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, who is at the Science Museum of Virginia. So in 2019, he and others, that's me in the top left, no beard, we did an observational kind of community science project in which we had mapped transects across the city of Norfolk. They've done this in Richmond and nearly a dozen other cities in the Commonwealth and hundreds of cities around the world. And this is a way, one, to bring in science into the community, and then also kind of empower the community to rethink and reshape how they plan and design their cities to reduce the urban heat out. So we had tens of thousands of observations, second by second, by second by second, over 4 times of transects. We took that data. There's the transect on the right-hand side for those of you that are interested. We then look at land use and land cover data and then model it out beyond my expertise. I'm not going to actually answer questions on the exact methods of that because that's why I have other partners in this project, right? And we modeled out those 4 time periods, so morning, afternoon, evening, and late evening. And if you zoom into the afternoon there, you see, if you're familiar with Norfolk or Hampton Roads region, you know that there are parts of Norfolk that are warmer on average than other parts. And you're thinking, oh, that's really cold. If you're looking at this in this blue, that's still 92 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's just, cartography 101, right? Blue is not necessarily cold in this instance. It's cold relative to the rest of the map, right? And so we saw temperatures in excess of 105 degrees. At the airport, the temperatures weren't observed that warm. So across the urban landscape, we see about a 15-degree difference. So depending on what zip code you live in, how much tree cover you have, right? That will in part determine what your thermal exposure may be, right? So then we take a variety of other metrics, looking at those social determinants, for example. So tree cover in the middle in green, with the land cover data that we model in the bottom left, look at socioeconomic factors at the census tract scale. And then we basically create a vulnerability index looking at what was the temperature like, but also whether there's other social factors. And this is a relatively new data set from the CDC. And it's much like the American Community Survey, if you're familiar with that. This is Community Resilience for Heat Estimates, CRE. It basically takes, I believe there's 13 metrics. Do you have a vehicle? You drive to somewhere to get cold, right? What's your income? What's your accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. And we have this map by which we look at exposure in terms of temperature, and then the CRE, the vulnerability metrics in this blue shade here, and the higher, darker shade indicates very warm temperature and also consequently very high vulnerability with respect to those social determinants. And so then this map can be used in part to inform policymakers or emergency managers or libraries or whatever to how do we invest in our local community, not just at the scale of a city, for example, right? but small-scale interventions in some of these more vulnerable communities, right? And so the question is why where? If you're familiar with Norfolk at all, this little area here, this is the Western Hemisphere's largest coal dumping plant, Norfolk Southern. So nobody lives there. It's just Norfolk Southern's multi-billion-dollar convention, which is somewhat related to climate change, but not related to this talk today. All right, so how do we address the issue of heat? We know that heat varies across the urban landscape. We know that heat kills people. So how do we address it? One solution is cooling centers. And this is from the CDC. Some of these reports highlight that how we implement and strategically place and prioritize cooling centers may be a method, one tool in our tool belt to reduce heat risk. Okay? Right, this question many of you probably thought of, right? Well, what's a cooling center? It's a great question. Tennessee describes a cooling center as a grocery store. Now, you can think, okay, you go to the grocery store and they have air conditioning, great. But if I'm hot and I don't have air conditioning, I've lost power, I don't have a car, I'm probably not going to go immediately go to the grocery store, right? That's not the first place I necessarily may go, right? Some of you may think the library. Well, is the library open at night? When maybe you're most vulnerable. Do libraries want people of all shapes and sizes in their library, right? So now we're getting into some other complicated, beyond climatology research questions, right? So it's a place of refuge. People can go to cooling centers to seek refuge from heat. Some cities use city parks. They define the city park as a cooling center, where you're still out in the sun, but maybe they have a swimming pool there. Or maybe there's tree canopy, or maybe there's other essential services that the city provides at these places, for example. But generally speaking, there's been very little research into the effectiveness of the placement of, or the effectiveness of the implementation of these cooling centers, right? In terms of operational systems, et cetera, right? So some colleagues, Jeremy Hoffman and others, and I did this for Virginia, which I'll highlight here in the next couple slides, but we also did this across the entire Southeast. And I highlight your eyes are drawn to Tennessee. You know your geography, right? All the little dots there, that's where the grocery stores were defined as cooling centers. So there's a lot more cooling centers in Tennessee just because of the way in which the state and the Department of Health there define cooling centers. But if you look at this map, you see pretty strong bias towards urban communities. Right? A lot of cooling centers in urban communities compared to maybe more rural landscapes. And this was published in the Southeast Geographer as a second iteration of a paper that was published in the Journal of Emergency Management of looking at the strategic placement of cooling centers in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so some of you may be familiar with where you are on this map, right? You're up the peninsula. And what we did, Jennifer Whitlaw at ODU and Nicole Hutton, who was formerly at Old Dominion, and I, we ran some geospatial analysis to look at who is within a driving distance range, or drive shed, or a walk shed of a cooling center. So if you're in a drive shed, that assumes that you can drive there within 15 minutes. Maybe that's too far. So we did this for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, also multiple buffers. But what happens if you don't have a car? 5-minute walk, 10-minute walk, right? 15-minute walk. Again, if it's 100 degrees, are you going to walk 15 minutes to the cooling center? Again, those are questions that are unanswered with this kind of exploratory research. But what we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you look at that map and you know anything about the population distribution of Commonwealth of Virginia, right? We found that very few people that are highly vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, the people that are non-white, right? People that do not have a car, they're not in close proximity to these cooling centers. So while there are 254 cooling centers, whatever the number is in my top of my head, I can't remember exactly. Most of those cooling centers are either right next to each other in the urban environment and or not placed within context of the most vulnerable. And the question again is the why of that. How do you cover that, better understand that research question? Zooming in here a little bit, you can read the word vomit on the top right if you're so inclined. Again, looking at the vulnerability map of Norfolk that we looked at in the earlier slides in the bottom right, you can start kind of cross-cutting different research questions here of where is it hot, where is it most vulnerable, but also where is the strategic placement of these cooling centers. And then moving forward is, okay, how do we improve the placement or improve the operational hours of these cooling centers? Because unsurprisingly, right, most of these cooling centers close at 5 o'clock. But the most vulnerable us are, probably needing reprieve outside of the traditional 9 to 5 Dolly Parton hours, right? So let's overlay heat deaths, heat incidences, morbidity, not mortality, excuse me. So this is a data set from the Department of Health from Virginia. It's aggregated across 5 different summer periods, 6 different summer periods. June, July, August. Heat deaths occur in May and heat deaths occur in September, but let's just go with this summer season. So we can't look at individual heat events. And this is also done, and the geographers in the room will appreciate this, right? This is done at the zip code level, which makes absolutely no sense from a spatial analysis standpoint, because most of the census data is at the census tract or census block or the county scale or independent city scale in Virginia, right? So there's a mismatch of the modifiable area unit problem there, right? So there's certainly challenges which this paper is under review, so that challenge may be expressed more thoroughly with that in mind. But you can see this spatial pattern, right? Heat impacts everywhere. By and large, most of the missing data there, the color is hard to distinguish on the slide, I apologize. Most of the missing data there is just not saying there's no heat incidents there, just saying they're not reporting it. Right? These are rich communities, there are poor communities, urban zip codes and rural zip codes alike. And what we're finding is that a lot of the heat instances are occurring in places that are not having cooling centers, right? And so these are kind of research questions moving forward in terms of how do we communicate the existence of cooling centers and or the value of cooling centers. How do we mitigate, do people feel that they can go there safely, right? Those are philosophy or sociology or psychology questions that we need to bring other stakeholders into this research question, these research questions to help us answer. I already mentioned the challenge with some of the data, with the Virginia Department of Health providing us zip code data, and then the census having those mismatches, and then the cities operate in a different scale, and are the cities working with the counties? And if, as cooling centers across the state border, will you go to that cooling center versus your county's cooling center? All kinds of, again, complex questions. And we know that, right, on average, the nighttime temperatures are actually warming faster than the daytime averages. So it's not necessarily a function of daytime high, it's hot, fine. But our nighttime temperatures are warming nearly double the rate of your daytime temperatures. A student of mine, I took a student's quote one of my first years teaching at Kent State, where I got my PhD, and she said, "I'm so ready for summer, woo!" And then she kind of thought, it's because I feel like we didn't have any winter this year. And who doesn't like summer, right? Sitting at the beach. I don't like the beach. It's one reason I moved. I don't like the sand. I like being hot. I like being humid. Anyways, I'm the minority in that. I get that. But there's lots of reasons and values to seasons, right? If you look at cherry blossom festivals, whether you're looking at Old Stumpy, which is no longer there in the Tidal Basin, in terms of when it blooms, or bloomed, excuse me. Now it's not there because they tore it out because of sea level rise. Again, a different discussion. Some of you are nodding, so you get it. How many of you have seen this rightmost image before? A couple of you maybe? One of you, great. 2 of you. So these are the cherry blossoms that we received from Japan in Kyoto, in Japan, the former capital of Japan. And they have a very long record of monks going outside, very unique people, and measuring and monitoring when the blooming of these cherry blossoms took place. And some years they bloomed very early, and some years they bloomed very late, right? And so you have this distribution. But if you look at that chart over the long term, the x-axis is time, what do you see? You see this like downward trajectory indicating a rapid change in the bloom date, indicating an earlier bloom date, right? And so they call this phenological mismatch potentially, right? When you have plants that are blooming and pollinators that aren't out there at the same time, that creates potential problems for pollination, food distribution, food security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? If you're planning the Gloucester Daffodil Festival, you want to know when those daffodils are going to bloom because your economy in part is tied to planning that daffodil festival. If you are off by a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that presents economic challenges. If you have pollen or allergies, you know what I'm talking about, right? We've seen this shift in the pollen season, an expansion of the pollen season. Some of my research there is highlighted. All the articles, all the grants, the Fulbright, all that. My mom only knows me based upon the yellow rectangle, National Geographic, because this article said something about my research once, and that was the only thing she knows that I do. She still thinks I'm a geologist. And she doesn't know why I can't move back to Pittsburgh. Anyway, if you look at ragweed season, right, you see a variability across space. Some places you have an advance of ragweed season by a month. That's significant for money, for insurance, for health outcomes, for just your well-being of coughing, sneezing, and whatever, right? And while we don't think 8 days is significant, right, we're seeing a trajectory of this becoming more exponential, not a linear curve, much like sea level rise, right? So the concern is, what does that look like? I'm not saying winter's going to go away, but if you talk to ski seasons or ski resorts, right, their snowfall isn't quite the same as it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And so some of them are beginning to shift some of their modes of operations to address that. And we can see impacts of climate change beyond heat that are related to a warming of the planet. There's an equation called the Claudy-Clapeyron equation. Anybody take physics? Clapeyron equation. It basically states that for every degree of warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more moisture, which is why in the summer it feels so gross, because the atmosphere can hold more moisture, right? Well, if you increase the temperature of the planet, what happens to the ability? You increase the ability to hold moisture, and so you lead to heavy rain events like Ellicott City, or like in Norfolk with hurricanes, or Hurricane Harvey in Houston, for example, right? And the left image, this is Tangier. This is what we call sunny day flooding. Or the state of Commonwealth of Virginia at one time would call this nuisance flooding. Which I always thought was ironic, because what type of flooding is not a nuisance? But that's, again, a policy question. Nate and I were talking about that a little bit earlier, right? And so these impacts of climate change are beyond the human health dimension. This is really about humanity now. We're talking about people having potentially to move, or their lives being disrupted, right? Ellicott City, southwest of Baltimore City in Maryland, had multiple 1,000-year flood events in the course of 5 years, right? Devastation. People's lives ruined. People on the Outer Banks, right, and their homes being washed into the ocean that you and I are on the hook for because of the National Flood Insurance Program. Not making any friends, but with this recording. Ghost forests, maybe you're familiar with ghost forests. If you go to Dorchester County in the eastern shore of Maryland, or Accomack County in Virginia, right, you go to the peripheral near the wetlands, and you'll see some of these like sticks sticking out of the wetland, for example. And that's because salt water is overwashed and intruded, and biology says most trees and salt water, no bueno, right? They don't go well, and so they die. They become these kind of lost landscapes. And even fast forward, even more so, is if you look at the eastern shore, look, geology lesson, this region by and large, most of it is sinking because of a variety of complex factors. Most of it's sinking, the seas are rising, we're taking a lot of groundwater out of the system. Google SWIP, the Sustainable Water Initiative for Tomorrow in Suffolk, Virginia. They're taking wastewater, they're injecting it back into the ground to reduce some of that land subsidence. Poop water, going back into the ground. Because, right, we're taking this water out and that landscape is sinking down. These aquifers are potentially threatened because of saltwater treatment on the eastern shore. All right, so let's talk about some opportunities to solve. This is an opportunity to solve. This is one way we can solve this. And for better or worse, this is how, by and large, we have solved a lot of these climate issues. But okay, plant trees. This is one solution, right? Plant trees. I remember in Norfolk, Baltimore City, they do the same thing. They do these free tree giveaways. Go get a tree. You can plant the tree, right? Okay, you have the place to put the tree. Do you have a yard? Right? If you're living in a city, a highly dense city, right, you may not have that space, so that's a challenge. Okay, what happens when you move? Does the person that moves in like that tree? How long does it take that little tree to grow? You get a little tree, like it's a stick. How long does it take that tree to grow? A couple years, right? So maybe we also need to move away from planting trees, yes. But we also need to walk and chew gum by also preserving and protecting the trees that we do have, particularly urban landscape that provide those long-term ecological habitats. I challenge my students to go sit in a parking lot and then measure your blood pressure. Like a big park, like a Walmart parking lot. They just sit there, like no trees, and they'll go sit in your city park, where your blood pressure comes down. So there's value beyond the shade in terms of public health, ecological services, habitat, water storage, air quality, cleaning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Was mentioned earlier the idea of redlining. So again, how do we solve this? Is we have to also have honest conversations about the why of where. Why do we have communities that are most vulnerable to heat? In part, not entirely, but in part, it's a function of systematic racism that predates all of us in this room in the 1930s and 1940s, right, with the redlining policies, right? And so if you look at this map, left side is from the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond, right? And you overlay the vulnerability map. It's not one-to-one, but it's pretty good, right? 100 years later. And it's not just heat, it's also flooding, it's also other aspects of vulnerability, right? And this has been done not just with this example I'm casually illustrating here with the examples I've provided you with Norfolk, but if you look at some of Hoffman's other work elsewhere, you know, dozens of cities in the US and around the world, they do the same thing in South Africa with apartheid. You find similar relationships in terms of historical discrimination tied to environmental risk exposure. A couple other ways. So beyond shade, interagency coordinator, right? A lot of public health agencies are not talking to emergency management communities. They talk different languages. They have different data sets. They have different scales. They have the same research question, but they're talking across each other rather than with each other. And that's a disciplinary challenge. And I would argue that the challenges of the 21st century require what I called an anti-disciplinary approach, that we use our lens of our disciplines as methods, but not, we need to focus on the challenges, not our disciplines. Lots of work on heat watch warning systems. Seville there is highlighted. I've worked on some heat watch warning systems elsewhere around the world, in Greece, for example, in California, they're doing similar work. And it also draws attention to, we talked about the rural versus urban divide, recognizing the world is not binary, but there's a lot of work being done in terms of occupational health hazards. And I had a little, little shade there at the bottom there because Florida and Texas recently rolled back their environmental protections to protect outdoor workers. I tell my students, I'm not here to tell you what to think, I'm here to make you think. So if you're like, oh, what the hell are you talking about? Good, Google, go home and Google. Lots of opportunity here to address this, right? I'm not a construction worker. I barely know the difference between the flathead and the other screwdriver, whatever it's called. See, I just proved my point, okay? We need all of these to address different challenges. So depending on where your lens is or your interests lie, right? If you're interested in institutional challenges, you're looking at that blue box, right? If you're really interested in environmental issues, you're looking at the green box, right? But you better be working across those different aspects. I have colleagues that work in architecture that are doing these things, or policy work, or how you build green infrastructure in newly built or newly constructed housing, for example, right? And this raises the question as I get ready to finish, when we talk about the idea of climate resilience, which is really the buzzword of the century, entire institutes and universities have kind of reframed their research agenda to this idea of resilience, and that's great. But what does resilience mean? And what does resilience mean for you? Is that the same for me? What does resilience look like in Tangier? What does that look like for Smith Island, right? Those are very different questions. Places are variable in terms of policy, in terms of experience, right? So I'll give you two examples there. One is Baltimore, using a local church as a resilient hub, so that during extreme events or outages, you can use that microgrid at the church as a place to kind of come together and build the sense of community and things. But that's an aspect of trust in that too, right? So it takes time. It's not just overnight, let me open it, and if I open it, they will come, right? That's not how this necessarily works. And then on the right-hand side, I already mentioned, kind of alluded to the idea of the Outer Banks and the homes in Rodanthe, for example, that almost every September, October, it's like, oh, there goes another one. And it makes national news or international news. And I'm just like, that house was sold 3 years ago. What are we doing? So resilience for whom? And who makes and how those decisions are made. And this is just the US, right? You can scale this to the globe, right? Bangladesh, for example, the tens of millions of people that live very low-lying in the river delta, right? And we can think about this at the global scale, across scales and across sectors, right? The UN does not currently define climate refugees as refugees. So how do you flee a country because it's being impacted by saltwater intrusion, and yet you're not afforded the protections? Again, not an area of research that I'm actively in on, but just raising questions about climate in the relationship to these really difficult questions, right? This issue this issue of scale. Because ultimately we need to both adapt to the consequences, raising our homes, building these microgrid systems, increasing the shade in our cities, et cetera, but we also have to address the causes of climate change, and that's heat trapping gases at every scale and across every sector, which is a really uncomfortable conversation for some, but I love this picture. This is my bike, one of my bikes. This is in Norfolk, Virginia, and if you look, if you squint on the right there, you see a for sale sign of this house, and you see the house in the background, the other lot that's elevated, right? And then you see, it's a blue sky, it's not raining, and you see the entire street is covered in water. But this house is for sale. But they do not have to disclose that it's in a flood zone. Which to me, looking at this picture, is just, I'm being recorded. So it's just crazy to me, but I digress. Happy to answer questions. Again, thank you for the invitation to come back to Williamsburg. Cheers. Oh, yeah, okay, no questions.
So you talked about the there and there, and how that kind of psychological distance has been created. Since working with environment and relating it to public health, have you seen if more people are willing to take action against climate change, since it's now like a personal issue?
I can't say I assess people's willingness or ability to address the issue of climate change, but I do think the way in which we communicate climate change matters. And so you used to talk about the polar bear and the seas are rising and 1 degree of warming per whatever. The science is not moving people. It doesn't. I mean, it just, right? Should we care? Yes, but and you look at the Clean Air Act, right? Nobody cared about the Clean Air Act until people were dying in their community. Denora in Pittsburgh, for example, or Love Canal, right? These events that pushed forward the policy in that example. So I do think, depending on where you are, right? In Hampton Roads, all I talk about climate change was sea level rise, because that's all anybody in Hampton Roads cares about. Let's just be, I mean, by and large, that's the reality, because it's the existential threat to everything that we know in the Chesapeake Bay region. Now, that's beginning to change, because we need to think about heat and we need to walk and chew gum. We need to both. But the audience matters. If you go to Kansas and talk about sea level rise, they don't care about sea level rise. Should they? Maybe, but they care about corn. They care about their economy. They care about their, water resources and the replenishment of the aquifers, for example. So communication matters. But again, most climatologists are not trained to communicate, right? We're trained to be scientists. I don't know if I answered your question, but kind of.
No, it did.
I usually have a bottle of vodka that helps this.
So at several times during your presentation, you're talking about research that you've done in a collaborative fashion with other folks and different skills that they may be brought to bear on the question that your group was interested in that you didn't necessarily have. Could you talk a little bit about how that works, or strategies for partnering with folks or finding good partnerships versus maybe ones that, okay, we got this done, but I may not work with them again, and what that looks like from a collaborative research perspective?
Sure, I think this is what makes research fun, but also at times infuriating, because I think, my background is in climatology. I'm trying to work with this epidemiologist. We're trained differently. Our methods are different. Our research question may be the same, but how we approach that end goal is very, so that requires us talking or meeting for coffee or drinks, or that takes time often, and to understand each other. So when I say mitigation to my engineer friends, they think of something entirely different than I do as a climatologist. So words, terms matter. And so coming to some understanding, not an agreement, but coming to an understanding of what are you talking about and what is your end goal, I think that takes time and some dedication in some way. So yeah, I've certainly worked with individuals that, yeah, let's keep doing this, we're doing great work. And then others, individual, life happens, what have you, you're like, let's do something else, right? And plenty of times, and talking more of the students at this moment in time, right? But plenty of times I can count on multiple hands how many projects I started and then like went nowhere. And you're like, this sucks. I just wasted 6 months of my life and my time and my energy, and I got negative results, and I can't publish negative results because nobody cares about negative results. And I'm being facetious, some of that, but it can be frustrating. So yeah, I think networking, talking across those different disciplines, and reading the epidemiology books so that they can share that expertise. Because I do think the days of us being trained to do this for the next 30 years of our lives, those days are over. Right? We're going to change our careers. We're going to change our interests. The research questions are, and the societal challenges are too vast to kind of be tackled by one necessary discipline.
Can you talk more about your career and kind of how you found your career path and maybe some advice that you would have for students who are figuring out their futures?
Yeah, I got rid of that slide. So I had a great AP biology teacher in high school, and I wanted to be a dentist. And then I looked at somebody's tooth and was like, I don't want to be a dentist. And then I took a chemistry class, and I hated the chemistry professor, so I changed my major. And then I said I really don't like the university I'm at, so I'm going to change my university. So after doing all of that, before I transferred, I was taking accounting, communication, Spanish, physiology, just because I still have the biology interest, and then some of the class, I can't remember what it was, doesn't matter. So very, very different classes in that list. And then I transferred out. And I majored in earth science meteorology, small state school south of Pittsburgh, and then went to a colloquium. I was the president of the organization and had a colloquium speaker who then became my master's advisor. And we were on some grants, and so we went and did some research, and I went international with him. And so I saved my PhD at Kent State, and then applied to 45 jobs, tenure track or not tenure track, or teaching or research, both here in the U.S. and around the world. And I had a handful of interviews, and I had one offer. So I moved to Virginia, and then for a variety of reasons, personally and professionally, decided to move to Towson University, and then got the Fulbright. So that's the trajectory. I think along the way you meet people. Some of you in this room will have lifelong friends, maybe like, I hate this guy. I don't even know this guy. Hopefully not. But you have lifelong friends that I still have friends in undergrad. Follow me on Twitter. I have some friends that still call me grandpa. Because when I transferred in, I was taking classes with freshmen. I was 3 years older than them, right? So they called me grandpa. 20 years later, whatever it's been, they still call me grandpa. So we have lifelong friends, and I think some of those friendships, you have beers or drinks or whatever, and you're conversing over coffee, and you're like, oh, that's an interesting research. I'm working on this. Okay, you learn, and I don't know, curiosity is fun. That's why one part I love doing what I do is teaching, and I think teaching students in particular, you have new ideas and you're creative. We were looking at some of the art earlier. I can't draw a stick figure, so you have skills that I have and vice versa. Right? You have skills I don't have, excuse me, and vice versa, right?
I had a question about how you approach coming up with questions for research and how your development of the why or of a research question has changed throughout your career.
The latter's hard, yeah. So I've always been interested in weather, and so my dissertation looked at seasonal variability in climate change. So it's really interesting, like the seasonal component. But that wasn't enough for a dissertation, right? That's a thesis. So my advisor was like, you need to do this other stuff. And so I think I found that niche of emergency management, public health, climate. And then I'll be frank with the latter part of your question now that I'm thinking about it. When I first went to Old Dominion, I met Don Ziegler, who was a professor at Old Dominion at the time. He's since passed. But he took me to a meeting, was like, hey, I do this stuff, geographic literacy. And so a lot of my research or scholarship, what have you, is really focused now on the engagement piece of talking to particularly K-12 teachers of how you talk about climate change in the classroom when there's no standards to talk about climate change in the classroom, and finding that niche. And so with Don's kind of guidance and mentorship, and I know others in this room would attest to this similarly, kind of just by happenstance kind of fell into that. And I think some of that is, everybody finds their way a little bit differently. So some people know exactly what they're going to do. I have friends that they only look at this really niche thing, and others are like, I'm interested in this, and I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in that, and I want to teach more, but not research more. So it's kind of finding that balance, and you'll fail, but I don't think it is failure. It's just kind of exploring and kind of seeing what may work for you. The best experience I ever had was in undergrad. I did an REU in Colorado, research experience for undergrads in NSF, and it was in an electrical engineering department. I'm a climatologist, and so we were looking at chill radars near Fort Collins, Colorado, and they're basically trying to assess, and the guy that was my REU advisor wrote the textbook for radar meteorology. So it's like, I'm working with Bringy? What? The Bringy? Like, what do you, like all the math that I still don't understand? But they were trying to, like rainfall estimates, or when close your eyes, imagine a raindrop, right? You all know what a raindrop looks like. With snow, it's uniform. As it falls, it's always uniform. So you can measure that really easily with radar. With snowfall, snow is very different. Like we all cut the things and they all look different. And so using the radar beam, you can't estimate snow the same way as you do with raindrops, excuse me. And so you're trying to, anyways, long and short, I did this whole REU 12 weeks in Fort Collins, which was great, fantastic hiking, great friends I met there, still have connection. And I left that REU and drove back to the Pittsburgh and was like, I hate this. I hate this work. I do not want to do this work. This is awful. So I was missing the applied piece. So that's kind of where I shifted into geography in some way. Kind of a roundabout answer, but got there in some way. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there, thanks for giving this talk. You were talking about critiquing terminology, and in our master's program, we're actually doing a research project with Virginia Sea Grant on looking on how to define resiliency to make it more kind of universal. So from your experience and in the line of work that you do, what aspects in a definition of resiliency would you include?
This is where you pause the recording. I don't know. That's a tough nut to crack. I'll be perfectly honest. Resilience implies to many is like bouncing back. But what if you're in New Orleans and you don't want to bounce back to where you were before Katrina? Like, you should be able to go beyond that. So I'm very critical of the term or idea of resilience. I don't think it's bad necessarily, but I do have challenges in terms of what does that look like for you as an individual or you as a community. And many of this resilience talk is like, right, Tangier Island's a great example. Right? Tangier Island, they're gonna be forced to move. I go there every summer with K-12 educators. It's a great place. Anybody been to Tangier or Smith Island? Yeah, it's a great seafood. Great people that work really hard and live on the water, and but their world is very different than ours. And yet we think, oh, climate change is happening, you're gonna have to move. If somebody came into your neighborhood and said you have to move, what are you gonna do? Oh, okay, let me pack my, no, you're gonna be like, right? So I think that's the humanity of climate change is often kind of what's missing in part is we have some serious, adapt to the consequences, right? We have to be, Scott Denning, is that the right name? Colorado State talks about climate change as the 3 S's. Simple, and you're like, it's not simple. Yeah, it is, it's simple. The planet's warming because of heat trapping gases, period. Next topic. You can get into the nuances, energy balance, all that, but it's simple. It's warming because of us. It's serious. We have to be serious about the consequences, right? Potentially catastrophic. Now, I'm not saying the planet's all going to die and doomsday. Michael Mann writes about this doomsday. It's not really effective in motivating people, right? We have to be serious, right, about potentially feet of sea level rise, right, of heat waves leading to places that are uninhabitable on the planet, right, the Persian Gulf area, right, in terms of humidity and how your body, anyways. But we also have to talk about the solutions too. But what those solutions look like for your community may not be appropriate here in my community. And what you think I should do is not necessarily what I think I should do. So how do you build that? How do you bridge that gap? Don't know that answer.
Yeah, just kind of building off of that, I guess what elements of resilience do you think are most important when it comes to like funding these like endeavors to like build like climate like sea level rise like adaptation strategies? Like what like resonates most with like investors or like governments?
I don't know the landscape well enough to answer, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no worries.
I mean, I've reviewed and been part of things of that sort, but I think that I have an idea in my head, but I also think, like, is this the best strategy? Like, yeah, that's making that community resilient. They're raising it $100,000 a pop. Okay. How is that scalable to Savannah, Charleston, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, England? Like, it's not scalable. So the honest questions are to be had is how do we Somebody once said, we have a 21st century population and 21st century climate. We have 20th century, early 20th century infrastructure, and we have 19th century policy. So if your policy is 200 years older than where the challenges are, that's a conundrum to crack. In Baltimore, you just had the Dolly crash, right, with running into the Key Bridge. And now the owners or boat operators, whatever, are using a 1860, 1870s law to get them out of the financial ramifications of that disaster. Some law that was written before anybody on the earth was alive, including Jimmy Carter, right? Happy birthday soon, right? Is going to be used in court for a 21st century problem of a ship that is enormous that ran aground and killed 6 people. So I have lots of stuff that I like talking about this though. I think it's a good thought experiment. And I do, Sea Grant's doing great work. Are you guys working together? Yeah, I sense the connection there. So good questions, yeah. Thanks. And my email's there, so just, or whatever, TikTok, I have TikTok, but I don't know how to use it. I just watch it. My students, they're like, what is this? I said this yesterday in class. What is that? I said, that's this thing called X. You can't X, right? You can tweet, but you can't X. But I think X is just a sounding board at some point. Anyways, that's. Any final questions or comments? Cool. Thank you again so much. Hang around some more.